That spike in cortisol increases alertness, motivation, and focus. It elevates your body temperature, speeds up your metabolism, and makes your nervous system more responsive to external stimuli. It's like the body's internal launch sequence. And the most effective performers in any field learn to leverage this window rather than waste it. They don't ease into the day passively. They build a routine that harnesses this neurochemical surge and channels it into purposeful behavior. The worst thing you can do during this window is stay horizontal, remain in low light, and scroll through artificial stimuli. That confuses the brain, it blunts the cortisol spike, and makes you groggy. The system was designed for movement and light exposure, not stillness and screens. What you want to do instead is stack your first few behaviors of the day to reinforce alertness, action, and cognitive clarity. Step 1 is light exposure. The photoreceptors in your eyes, especially the melanopsin incontinence cells in the retina, are sensitive to natural light. When sunlight, or even a strong artificial full spectrum light, enters your eyes in the morning, it sends a signal to a structure in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, the master circadian clock. That signal triggers a cascade that enhances the cortisol pulse, raises your core body temperature, and locks in your biological wake-up time. This is critical for optimizing your mental and physical state, not just for the morning, but for the entire day. Step 2 is physical movement. This doesn't need to be intense. A short walk, mobility work, or a basic workout immediately after waking reinforces the brain's understanding that it's time to be alert and active. Movement stimulates the release of epinephrine and dopamine, which work in tandem with cortisol to heighten focus and motivation. Physical action early in the day also teaches your nervous system to associate waking up with forward momentum, not hesitation, delay, or distraction. Step 3 is task initiation. This is where most people fall short. They wait to feel ready before starting work. But your brain is most primed for effort within 1 through 2 hours of waking, when cortisol levels are still elevated and neuromodulators are abundant. This is the ideal time to tackle cognitively demanding tasks: writing, planning, solving, or learning. If you procrastinate during this window, you're ignoring the most biologically optimized time to engage your mind. You're asking your brain to perform later in the day, when it's less chemically prepared to do so. Cortisol also plays a role in habit formation. Actions taken when cortisol is elevated are more likely to be remembered and repeated. This is due to its interaction with the hippocampus and amygdala, brain structures responsible for encoding memory and emotion. When you pair a consistent morning routine with the natural cortisol spike, those behaviors become sticky. You're not just building habits, you're encoding identity. You're teaching your brain that this is who I am when I wake up. There's also a metabolic benefit. Morning cortisol enhances fat mobilization and glucose metabolism. It prepares your body to use energy efficiently. If you fast or train during this window, you may further amplify that effect. Although that's a personal variable and not necessary for everyone, what matters more is that you're working with your biology, not against it. You're using the tools built into your physiology to drive consistency, clarity, and control. Cortisol, when mismanaged, can lead to burnout and anxiety. But when understood and timed correctly, it becomes a performance enhancer. It gives you a window of biochemical readiness that can serve as the foundation for everything else you build during the day. Most people walk around with a vague idea of who they are, or worse, who they want to be, but they never back it with consistent act. They confuse intention with identity. But the truth is this: the brain doesn't register what you hope to be, it registers what you do, and it builds your self-position based on what you repeat. Identity is not found in your beliefs, your dreams, or your internal narratives. It's wired through behavior. Your brain is constantly updating its internal model of you. This model isn't based on your thoughts. It's based on patterns of action that can be observed, measured, and repeated. Every time you take an action, whether it's disciplined or impulsive, structured or chaotic, productive or avoidant, your nervous system is watching. It's saying, this is who we are now. That internal record is not emotional, it's neural. And over time, those behaviors form identity circuits, durable patterns that shape what you believe you're capable of. This happens in the cortical, striatal, thalamic loops, networks in the brain that integrate intention, action, and habit. The prefrontal cortex may generate goals and values, but it's the basal ganglia that stores behavioral patterns as automatic routines. And once a routine is repeated enough times, it becomes a core part of how you perceive yourself. So if you want to change who you are, you don't start with belief. You start with consistent, observable action. This is why affirmations and mental visualization fall short unless they're paired with physical execution. Saying, I'm disciplined doesn't mean anything if you keep hitting the snooze button. Visualizing success does nothing unless you put in the reps. You don't become confident by thinking. You become confident by doing something challenging repeatedly until your brain updates its model to say, we are the kind of person who does this. That's how identity changes. Neuroscience has shown that the dopaminergic system, particularly the mesolimbic pathway, plays a key role in reinforcing behavior and shaping motivation. When you complete a task or push through discomfort, dopamine is released not just as a reward, but as a teaching signal. It flags the behavior as relevant and worth repeating. Over time, the accumulation of these micro wins sculpts a sense of self that is built on evidence, not imagination. And this matters because identity is the lens through which you filter your choices. If you see yourself as someone who always follows through, you act accordingly. If your internal model says you're lazy, disorganized, or inconsistent, your behavior will match that too. Not because it's destiny, but because it's been reinforced through inaction or avoidance. The good news is this: the same neural systems that reinforce the old identity can be rewired with new input. But the input must be physical, movement, effort, repetition. Your nervous system learns by doing, not by overthinking, not by waiting for motivation, not by accumulating knowledge without applying it. You become who you are based on what you repeatedly choose to engage in. Whether that's writing every day, training every morning, leading with honesty, or showing up consistently when it's inconvenient, those acts become the proof your brain needs to believe the story you're telling it. Even more, identity solidifies under resistance. When you do something despite fear, hesitation, or discomfort, your brain flags that as significant. The amygdala gets involved, emotional salience goes up, neuroplasticity increases. That's the moment where a new identity imprint is most likely to occur. Not when everything is easy, but when your system is challenged and you respond with intention-backed action. That's when the old self cracks and the new one begins to wire. There's also a deeper layer, predictive coding. The brain is always trying to predict what you will do next based on your past. If you've skipped workouts all month, it expects you to skip again. If you've hit your deadlines every day for a week, it starts to anticipate follow through. You override the old predictions by producing new behavior that contradicts the prior model. It doesn't take months to begin this process. It takes one decision repeated under friction, not just under ideal conditions. So when people say, I'm not a morning person, I'm bad at finishing things, or I'm not motivated, what they're really saying is, my past behavior has trained my brain to expect this pattern. But the brain doesn't care about who you were. It adapts to what you repeatedly do from this point forward. Identity is plastic. Not imagined, earned. And it's earned one rep, one choice, one disciplined action at molecule most commonly associated with reward and motivation. But what's more important is what dopamine teaches the brain. It tells your nervous system, This behavior matters. Do this again. Over time, those small hits of dopamine reinforce specific circuits. You're not just completing tasks, you're training your brain to value effort, precision, and consistency. This process begins in the striatal circuits of the brain, specifically in the basal ganglia. These structures are responsible for forming habits, encoding routines, and automating behavior. When a behavior is repeated, and especially when it's rewarded, the brain starts to offload it to these deeper systems. That means it requires less conscious effort over time. The action becomes more reflexive. That's how brushing your teeth became automatic. That's how scrolling your phone became unconscious. And that's exactly how you can build discipline, through deliberate, repeated daily wins. But the win must be real. The brain doesn't rewire from imagined success. It rewires from embodied action. You must move your body, complete the loop, and finish the task. Half-done goals, abandoned intentions, and mental rehearsals don't register the same way. The nervous system needs completion to mark a win. That's how it knows to strengthen a circuit. If you write 10 sentences, that's a win. If you do one more rep at the gym than yesterday, that's a win. If you wake up at the time you said you would, that's a win. These may seem minor, but your brain doesn't care about the size of the goal. It cares about repeatability. There's also a psychological layer to this. Every time you follow through, you're not just completing a task, you're casting a vote for your identity. Your brain tracks what kind of person you are based on what you do, not what you say. So if you act in alignment with discipline today, even in a small way, your self-perception shifts slightly. That shift is subtle, but with enough repetition, it becomes a new default identity. This isn't positive thinking. It's identity built through behavior and biologically encoded belief. Another important factor is wins logged early in the day carry more weight neurologically. That's because the brain is naturally primed in the morning with a higher baseline level of cortisol and epinephrine, neuromodulators that increase alertness and readiness for effort. When you take advantage of that early window to create even a small success, the brain anchors that momentum and often extends it into the rest of the day. This is why winning the morning isn't a motivational slogan, it's a neurochemical strategy. Furthermore, when you create streaks, sequences of successful actions across multiple days, the brain starts to develop anticipation loops. These are circuits that expect the behavior and make it easier to initiate. Skipping one day doesn't destroy the streak, but it weakens the signal. That's why consistency, not perfection, is the foundation of rewiring. Missing once is fine. Missing twice starts a new habit in the wrong direction. And the brain does not make moral judgments. It strengthens whatever you do most often, whether it's procrastination or performance. There's also the role of emotional salience. When you celebrate the win, not externally, but internally, you increase the impact. A moment of recognition, a pause to acknowledge the effort, a small surge of pride that amplifies the dopamine release. It tells the brain that mattered. When you ignore the win, you reduce its neurochemical impact. So train yourself to feel the small victory, lock it in. That's how you teach the brain to crave forward movement. The human brain was not designed for achievement. It was designed for survival. Its default mode is energy conservation, avoidance of unnecessary risk, and staying inside the boundaries of what is familiar and predictable. This means that the resistance you feel when you try to do something hard, waking up early, going to the gym, starting a project, having a difficult conversation, is not weakness. It's biology. It's an ancient system trying to protect you from discomfort, uncertainty, and potential failure. But here's the critical point. Your resistance is not a stop sign, it's a signal. And when you learn how to interpret that signal correctly, you can use it to your advantage. Resistance shows up at the edge of your comfort zone. It's the friction that appears when your actions begin to challenge the brain's built-in drive for efficiency. And your ability to override that resistance consciously and consistently is what separates action takers from overthinkers. From a neuroscience perspective, resistance is often the result of a conflict between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. The prefrontal cortex is your executive function. It's responsible for decision-making, planning, and long-term goals. The limbic system, especially the amygdala, is more primitive. It's reactive, emotional, and protective. When you consider doing something hard or uncomfortable, the limbic system often fires up first. It sends signals like anxiety, dread, procrastination. These are not logical responses. They're emotional interference patterns, rooted in survival instincts. To override them, you need to engage the top-down control systems of the brain. That means you use deliberate cognitive strategies to suppress reactive signals and enforce intentional behavior. One of the most effective tools is framing. When your brain says, "This is hard," you reframe it as, "This is growth." When it says, "I don't feel like it," you respond with, "I'm not here to feel like it. I'm here to execute." That internal language matters. It's not just psychological, it changes your physiological response to the task. You can literally reduce the amygdala's reactivity with conscious reappraisal. Another tool is action initiation under resistance. Neuroscience research shows that when you begin moving toward a task, physically standing up, walking toward your workspace, opening the project file, your brain starts to shift from hesitation to engagement. This is because the motor circuits in the brain feed back into emotional and cognitive networks. Movement itself can suppress emotional resistance. Sitting still, ruminating, and negotiating with yourself only strengthens the resistance loop. Breaking the loop with motion, any motion, gives you leverage. Breath work is also relevant. When resistance shows up as anxiety, tension, or hesitation, you can modulate your internal state with specific breathing patterns. For example, a physiological sigh, 2 quick inhales through the nose followed by a slow exhale through the mouth, has been shown to lower levels of autonomic arousal almost immediately. This shifts your internal state and can create just enough calm to help you move forward. It's a biological override, a nervous system reset in under a minute. You also need to understand that resistance is not a signal of incapacity. It is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. In fact, the presence of resistance often means you're doing something important. The brain only pushes back when it detects effort. If there's no resistance, there's probably no meaningful growth. The goal is not to eliminate resistance. The goal is to build a systematic response to it. That system is built through repetition. Every time you override resistance, even in a small way, you strengthen a neural pathway that says, "I act in spite of discomfort." That becomes part of your cognitive identity. The first time you do it, it feels like a fight. The 10th time, it feels like a pattern. The 100th time, it feels like who you are. The circuitry becomes default instead of deliberate. Discipline is not about always wanting to act. It's about acting even when you don't want to. The brain can be trained to reduce its resistance response, not by thinking differently, but by responding differently. When resistance arises, you move anyway. You step forward. You don't negotiate. You interrupt the pattern with behavior, not with thought. Behavior reconditions the nervous system faster than intention ever will. Your nervous system takes notes on what you tolerate and what you execute. If you cave to resistance often, it becomes louder. If you challenge it often, it becomes weaker. The brain adapts to your standards. It rewires based on what you consistently reinforce. Resistance may be instinctive, but so is adaptation. You just have to choose which instinct you're going to train. Most people think of cortisol as a stress hormone. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Cortisol is not your enemy. It's a powerful tool. It's one of the most misunderstood hormones in the body because it's associated with chronic stress and burnout. But in its natural rhythm, cortisol is not only healthy, it's essential. If you know how to align your behavior with its natural release, You can use it to prime your brain and body for peak performance. Cortisol follows a pattern known as the circadian rhythm, a 24-hour biological clock that governs alertness, metabolism, and hormone release. One of the most important features of this rhythm is something called the cortisol awakening response. Within the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, your body experiences its largest spike in cortisol levels for the entire day. This is not a mistake. It's nature's way of preparing you for movement, problem solving, and decision making. Most people wait for motivation before they take action. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the human nervous system actually works. The truth is, action creates motivation, not the other way around. Inside the human brain, particularly in the midbrain, there's a system called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. It's often described as the reward pathway, but that's too simplistic. Dopamine doesn't just reward outcomes, it's released in anticipation of forward movement. The key here is that dopamine is about pursuit, not just achievement. When you force yourself to take even a small action, especially when you don't feel like it, you trigger that system. That release of dopamine then reinforces the behavior, making it easier to do again. This is not just a psychological trick. It's a physiological loop. It's real biology. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for planning and decision-making, has to coordinate with deeper, more ancient parts of the brain, like the basal ganglia, which controls movement initiation. When you decide to act, these regions begin to communicate. If you sit and ruminate, that connection weakens. But if you move, if you stand up, walk forward, write the first sentence, do the first push-up, you activate that circuit and reinforce it. Each repetition makes it stronger, just like a muscle. You're literally wiring your brain for taking action. Now, here's what most people don't realize. Your brain is more likely to release dopamine when you move toward a goal than when you achieve it. This is why waiting for the feeling of motivation is backwards. The system is built to respond to action, not to precede it. When you embrace this and take action despite resistance, your biology starts to work for you instead of against you. There's another system that plays a major role in action readiness, the sympathetic nervous system. This system is often labeled as the fight or flight system, but again, that's an oversimplification. It's actually your mobilization system. It gets you ready to do hard things. When you're alert, stressed, or slightly uncomfortable, that system is turned on. And that can be used to your advantage. If you reframe that elevated state, not as anxiety, but as energy, you change your relationship with stress. You can convert that physiological tension into fuel for action. Let's go even deeper. The act of simply directing your visual attention toward a specific point in your environment, particularly in the center of your visual field, creates a cascade of activation in brain areas linked to movement and decision-making. Narrowed visual focus correlates with readiness to act. Wide panoramic vision is associated with relaxation, passive states. This means you can use your own eyes to change your state. Stare at a single target, a notebook, a task, a screen, and keep your body still. That act primes the brain to shift into goal-directed behavior. It's a primitive but powerful mechanism. You can also hack this system with deliberate discomfort. The human brain is built to adapt to stress, not avoid it. When you expose yourself to mild stress, a cold shower, a difficult workout, a challenging conversation, and you push through it, you're activating neural circuits that tell the brain this organism takes action under pressure. That feedback loop is reinforced. And each time you do that, the brain becomes more efficient at initiating that same action in the future. The most important takeaway is this: you can't think your way into action. Thinking is a simulation, and the brain knows the difference. It doesn't release dopamine for imagined progress. It releases dopamine for real physical movement. Steps taken, work started, resistance broken. And resistance will always be there. Your brain's default mode is conservation, energy saving. It evolved for survival, not productivity. But we no longer live in a world of physical scarcity. We live in a world of mental overload. So the challenge today isn't avoiding predators, it's avoiding paralysis. The way out is to use biology as a lever. Use motion to trigger motivation. Use your body to lead your brain. What begins as a push becomes a pattern. What starts with friction transforms into flow. And the more you act, the more you force yourself to act, the more your brain begins to expect it. That's neuroplasticity, that's habit formation, that's the biology of action. The way you use your eyes determines the state of your mind. Visual focus is not just about seeing, it's a direct lever into your nervous system. Most people don't realize this, but your visual system is an extension of your brain. The retina, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of your eyes, is literally brain tissue that sits outside the skull. It connects directly to brain regions involved in movement, attention, and arousal. So when we talk about taking action, visual focus becomes a controllable tool for switching on those systems. Let's break this down. There are two fundamental types of visual focus: narrow focus and panoramic vision. Narrow focus, when you lock your gaze on a single point, is linked to the sympathetic nervous system, which prepares you for action. This is what your brain does automatically when you're under threat or intensely focused. It narrows the aperture of attention, zeroes in on the target, and activates the circuits for movement. The state is not just mental, it's neural, electrical, and chemical. You're triggering a cascade that prepares your entire system to move forward. On the flip side, when your eyes go soft and you take in the entire visual field, a wide-angle view engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which is associated with calm, rest, and recovery. This is what happens when you stare out at the horizon or relax your gaze during meditation. Your heart rate slows, cortisol levels drop, and alertness fades. Both states are useful, but when the goal is action, you need to deliberately narrow your vision. This is not metaphorical, it's mechanical. The act of converging your eyes on a single object, a phone screen, a book, a to-do list, your hands in motion, sends a signal to the midbrain and the premotor cortex, telling your system, prepare to do something. And those brain areas don't just prepare your muscles, they prime your motivational circuits. Focused vision increases norepinephrine and acetylcholine in the brain, two key neurochemicals that enhance alertness and task engagement. You're literally sharpening your mental blade by focusing your eyes. What's powerful here is that this is under voluntary control. You don't have to wait to feel ready. You can induce a state of readiness by choosing to fix your gaze. The brain responds to what you focus on visually, and that in turn dictates what you prioritize cognitively. In practical terms, this means that when you sit down to work, train, or execute any task, start by anchoring your gaze. Don't let your eyes wander. Don't multitask. Lock onto one thing. That single point focus is a neurological switch. There's also a feedback loop at play. Sustained visual focus increases frontal cortical activity, which governs planning, execution, and willpower. The longer you maintain that focus, the more the brain reinforces the behavior. And when the visual system is engaged in this way, it also suppresses irrelevant background noise, both sensory and emotional. This is why intense focus can feel calming to some people, because it drowns out internal chatter and amplifies intentional behavior. It's not just about seeing something, it's about commanding your system to lock in. Even the small act of bringing a task physically closer to your face can increase focus. That proximity shrinks the visual field, pushing your brain into a more goal-oriented mode. This is why athletes, snipers, surgeons, all high-performance individuals learn to control where and how they look. Their focus is not accidental. It's trained. It's tactical. And in a world flooded with distractions, understanding the role of visual focus becomes a competitive advantage. Every time you shift your gaze to a new stimulus, a phone notification, a moving shadow, a passing thought, you trigger what's called a saccade. That saccade costs the brain energy and breaks the loop of concentration. You're leaking cognitive fuel. But if you resist that impulse and instead train your gaze to stay fixed, your attention follows your vision. The body follows attention. And behavior follows the body. Vision is the on-ramp to attention. Attention is the gateway to action. You don't need motivation to begin. You need to aim your eyes. Where you look determines where you go. Your brain is not fixed. It's a dynamic rewiring machine that adapts based on what you do repeatedly. This is the principle of neuroplasticity, and it's one of the most powerful mechanisms in your biology. What you do every day, not occasionally, not when you feel like it, but consistently, changes the architecture of your brain. And the smallest wins, if repeated daily, are more effective than massive breakthroughs done once in a while. When you accomplish even a minor task, making your bed, writing a paragraph, finishing a workout, resisting a distraction, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine.